Howdy folks, and welcome to Saddle and Sixskin. I'm your host, and today we've got a tale of the Old West that's sure to stir your soul, especially if you're over 40. You know, the kind of story where hardship meets grit, and hope flickers in the darkest corners. Now, if you enjoy stories about the strength of the human spirit, Old West or not, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin, so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. The mountain wind howled through the valley, a lonely sound that mirrored the trembling in Emma's bones. She stood beside the weathered wagon, her threadbare dress whipping around her ankles in the relentless gale. The man they called Jake, a figure of quiet strength and rugged resolve, had just lifted her up with such gentle care. His calloused hands, so steady and sure, offered a support she hadn't felt in a long time. Did she dare hope that her luck was finally changing? Maybe a helping hand was all that was needed to help her up again. Would it last? Behind them, the townspeople, who had mocked her only hours before, now watched in stunned silence from the store's wooden porch. Their cruel laughter, the kind that stings more than any physical blow, had died away, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Emma's fingers gripped the wagon's rough wooden edge, her knuckles white with tension, as she looked down at Jake's weathered face. What was that? Was that something new? In his eyes, she saw something that no one had shown her in months. Respect, dignity, a recognition of her worth that the town had forgotten existed. It was as if he could see past the worn dress and the hollow cheeks to the woman she truly was, the woman she had almost forgotten herself. The pride in his expression as he helped her settle onto the wagon seat made her chest tighten with an emotion she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. But to understand how Emma came to be lifted onto that wagon with such reverence, we must return to where her story truly began, in the harsh reality of a frontier town where survival often came at the cost of one's pride. Now if you're finding this story as touching as I am, consider liking and subscribing to Saddle and Sixskin for similar stories from the Old West. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Emma clutched her empty stomach and stared at the general store's wooden steps. 3 days had passed since her last real meal, and the gnawing hunger had become a constant companion, as familiar as her own heartbeat. Her once fine dress, now patched and faded, hung loose on her diminishing frame. You see, she wasn't always this way. She had dignity and respect, and it had been taken from her. Was she able to return to a dignified life? The fabric that had once been a deep blue now resembled the color of a winter sky, bleached by sun and worn thin by hardship. She had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart heavy with loss. The consumption had taken her husband first, then their infant son, leaving her alone in a world that showed little mercy to women without protection. The small savings they had accumulated vanished quickly to doctor's bills and funeral costs. And soon Emma found herself among the growing number of displaced souls wandering the frontier, searching for a place to belong. The general store loomed before her like a monument to everything she could no longer afford. Through the dusty windows, she could see shelves lined with provisions, sacks of flour and cornmeal, strips of jerky hanging from hooks, and jars of preserved fruits that made her mouth water with longing. How could she come up with a way to get some food? The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery section, carried on the morning breeze like a cruel reminder of better times. Emma's hands trembled as she approached the store's entrance, her worn boots making soft sounds against the wooden planks. She had swallowed her pride many times in recent weeks. But each request for help seemed to chip away another piece of the woman she used to be. Had she been defeated? Would she ever recover? Now, if you're finding this as engaging as I am, why not hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin for similar stories from the Old West? The woman who had once hosted dinner parties in her modest home back east, who had worn silk gloves to church on Sundays, who had never imagined she would one day stand outside a frontier store preparing to beg for scraps. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and immediately she felt the weight of judgmental stares. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, stood near the fabric counter with 2 other well-dressed women. their conversation dying abruptly as Emma entered. Their eyes swept over her appearance with undisguised disdain, taking in every patch on her dress, every scuff on her boots, every sign of her diminished circumstances. Behind the counter, Mr. Henderson looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who had already decided what kind of customer she would be. His thin lips pressed together in a line of disapproval as Emma approached, her steps hesitant and her voice barely above a whisper. Was there any chance of getting help? Please, sir, Emma began, her words catching in her throat like thorns. I was wondering if you might have any work I could do. I can clean or organize your stock or help with your books. I have experience with numbers and correspondence. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, drawing on reserves of dignity she had thought were exhausted. Mr. Henderson's laugh was sharp and dismissive. He cut through the store's quiet atmosphere like a blade. Work? Look at you, woman. You can barely stand upright. What use would you be to anyone? His voice carried easily through the store, ensuring that every customer could hear Emma's humiliation. The women by the fabric counter began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying just enough for Emma to catch fragments of their cruel observations. Disgraceful, she heard Mrs. Patterson murmur. In my day, decent women didn't parade their poverty around like a badge of honor. Was there anyone who could help, or was she truly alone in her time of need? Emma's cheeks burned with shame, but desperation gave her the courage to continue. I don't need much, sir. Just enough for some flour and perhaps a small piece of salt pork. I'm willing to work hard for whatever you can spare. Work hard? Mr. Henderson's voice rose with mocking credulity. You want me to pay you to stumble around my store? Probably stealing whatever you can get your hands on. He gestured toward her with his pen as if she were some curious specimen rather than a human being in distress. I've seen your type before. Today it's work you want. Tomorrow you'll be back begging for charity. And next week you'll be causing trouble for decent folks. Was there any hope of getting the help she needed? The cruelty in his words hit Emma like physical blows. Each syllable designed to strip away another layer of her remaining self-respect. She stood there swaying slightly on her feet as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. The store seemed to spin around her. The faces of the other customers blurring together into a sea of judgment and rejection. Please, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. I have nowhere else to go. The laughter that erupted from the group of women was like ice water thrown in Emma's face. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her silk dress rustling with each movement, her face twisted with the kind of self-righteous indignation that only the comfortable can afford. Perhaps you should have thought of that before you found yourself in such circumstances, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Surely there were choices you could have made, precautions you could have taken. Emma's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The implication in Mrs. Patterson's words was clear. It cut deeper than any direct insult could have. These women, safe in their comfortable lives, could not imagine the series of tragedies that had brought Emma to this point. They saw only what stood before them now. A woman brought low by circumstances they preferred to believe she had somehow brought upon herself. Now if you're finding this as engaging as I am, why not hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin for similar stories from the Old West. I lost my husband and child to consumption, Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I worked as long as I could, but when the sickness came to our town, there was no work to be found. I sold everything I owned just to survive long enough to reach Cedar Ridge. Mr. Henderson waved her words away as if they were nothing more than smoke. Everyone has a sad story, woman. That doesn't entitle you to charity from hard-working folks who have earned what they have. He turned back to his ledger with deliberate dismissal. I suggest you move along before you drive away my paying customers. The humiliation was complete, total, and devastating. Emma stood there for a moment longer, hoping against hope that someone in that store might show her even the smallest kindness. The briefest recognition of her humanity. But the faces around her remained cold, closed, determined to see her as something less than themselves. She turned toward the door, her movements slow and deliberate, each step requiring tremendous effort. The whispers followed her. Cruel observations about her appearance, her circumstances, her presumed moral failings. The bell above the door chimed again as she stepped back onto the wooden porch, and the sound seemed to echo in her chest like a funeral toll. Outside, the morning sun felt harsh against her face. The street stretched before her like an endless desert of possibility and despair. Other townspeople had gathered, drawn by the commotion inside the store, and now they watched her emergence with the same morbid curiosity that draws crowds to accidents and disasters. Emma stood on those wooden steps, surrounded by the judgment of an entire community. She felt something inside her begin to crack. Not break, not shatter, but crack like ice on a pond in early spring. Through that crack, something cold and hard began to seep in. It was not bitterness exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity about the world she found herself in and the people who inhabited it. Now if you're enjoying the story about someone getting past obstacles, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of speculation and judgment. Emma could feel their eyes on her like physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making each breath more difficult than the last. Some of the onlookers were people she had tried to approach for work in previous weeks. Storekeepers and housewives who had turned her away with varying degrees of politeness or cruelty. "Look at her just standing there," someone whispered loud enough for Emma to hear, probably planning what to steal next. "I heard she's been sleeping in the old barn behind Miller's place," another voice added. "Decent folks shouldn't have to look at such things." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, trying to summon the strength to walk away with whatever dignity she had left. The hunger in her stomach had become a living thing, clawing at her insides, making her feel lightheaded and unsteady. She had not eaten in 3 days, and before that, her meals had been sparse and irregular. The physical weakness was beginning to match the emotional exhaustion that had been building for months. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed a figure at the edge of the crowd that seemed different from the others. A tall man with broad shoulders and weathered clothing stood slightly apart from the townspeople. His dark eyes fixed not on Emma with curiosity or judgment, but on the crowd itself with something that looked like disgust. His presence was quiet but somehow commanding, and Emma found herself studying his face with the desperate hope of someone drowning who has spotted a potential lifeline. The man they called Jake had been watching the scene unfold from the moment Emma entered the store. He had come to town for supplies, as he did once a month, riding down from his cabin high in the mountains where he lived alone, with only his thoughts and the changing seasons for company. He was not a man given to involving himself in the affairs of townspeople, having learned long ago that civilization often brought out the worst in human nature rather than the best. But something about the woman's quiet dignity in the face of such cruelty had caught his attention. He had seen her around town in recent weeks, always moving with purpose despite her obvious hardship, always maintaining a posture that spoke of inner strength, even as her circumstances grew more desperate. Unlike the townspeople, Jake recognized the signs of someone who had fallen from better circumstances rather than someone who had never known them. As Emma stood on the porch, swaying slightly from hunger and humiliation, Jake made a decision that would change both their lives. He stepped forward through the crowd, his movement causing conversations to halt and heads to turn. The townspeople knew Jake by reputation if not by personal acquaintance. He was the mountain man who appeared in town periodically, always polite but distant, always conducting his business efficiently before disappearing back into the wilderness that had shaped him. "Ma'am," Jake said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd with quiet authority. His tone was respectful, even formal, a stark contrast to the treatment Emma had just received inside the store. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Mr. Henderson." Emma looked up at Jake with surprise and weariness. Experience had taught her to be cautious of men who approached her, especially in her vulnerable state. But something in his manner, the careful distance he maintained, the respectful tone of his voice, made her pause rather than immediately retreat. "I have need of someone to help with my household," Jake continued, his words measured and deliberate. "The work would include cooking, cleaning, and general maintenance of my cabin. The pay would be fair, and room and board would be provided." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "If you're interested in honest work for honest wages." The crowd around them had fallen completely silent, shocked by this unexpected development. Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway of his store, his face red with indignation at having his judgment so publicly contradicted. Mrs. Patterson and her companions pressed forward, their expressions a mixture of outrage and fascination. "Jake Morrison," Mrs. Patterson called out, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Surely you can't be serious. This woman is clearly not suitable for any kind of respectable employment." Jake turned to look at Mrs. Patterson with the same steady gaze he had given Emma, but now his eyes held a coldness that made the banker's wife take an involuntary step backward. "I reckon I'm capable of making my own decisions about who I employ, ma'am," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, no raised tone, but there was something in it that made it clear the conversation was over. Emma stared at Jake in disbelief, her mind struggling to process this sudden reversal of fortune. After weeks of rejection and humiliation, here was a man offering her exactly what she had been begging for, honest work with fair compensation. But years of hardship had made her cautious, and she found herself searching his face for signs of the ulterior motives she had learned to expect from men who offered help to desperate women. "I don't understand," Emma said softly. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what kind of worker I am or whether I can be trusted." Jake's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, Emma caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his stoic exterior. "I know you've been asking for work instead of begging for charity," he said. "I know you've maintained your dignity in the face of treatment that would break most people. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The simple honesty of his words hit Emma like a physical force. After months of being treated as less than human, here was someone who saw her as a person worthy of respect and opportunity. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to show such vulnerability in front of the crowd that had just finished humiliating her. "The work would be hard," Jake continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "Mountain living isn't easy, and I won't pretend otherwise. But you'd have a warm place to sleep, regular meals, and wages that would allow you to save money for whatever future you choose to build." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The offer was more than she had dared to hope for, but it also represented a step into the unknown that both terrified and exhilarated her. Life in the mountains with a man she didn't know carried its own risks. But staying in Cedar Ridge meant slow starvation and the gradual erosion of whatever dignity she had left. "I accept," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I accept your offer, Mr. Morrison," Jake replied. "Call me Jake." "And you are," she replied, then paused, realizing she had been thinking of herself only as Emma for so long that her surname felt foreign on her tongue. "Emma Walsh." Jake nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal their agreement with more finality than any written contract. "I'll need to finish my business in town. Then we can head up to the cabin. It's about a 2-hour ride, and we'll want to arrive before dark." The crowd around them began to disperse. Their entertainment apparently over. But Emma could feel their eyes still upon her, their whispered conversations following her like shadows. Mr. Henderson had retreated into a store, but not before shooting Jake a look of pure resentment. Mrs. Patterson and her companions lingered nearby, their faces showing a mixture of disappointment and curiosity about this unexpected turn of events. Emma stood on the porch, waiting as Jake conducted his business inside the store. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next meal or the next place to sleep. The mountains had always seemed forbidding to her, wild and dangerous. But now they represented possibility, a chance to rebuild her life away from the judgment and cruelty of people who had never known real hardship. When Jake emerged from the store, his arms full of supplies, Emma noticed the way Mr. Henderson's manner had changed completely. The storekeeper was now all politeness and deference, his earlier cruelty apparently forgotten in the face of Jake's obvious ability to pay for his purchases. The transformation was so complete and shameless that Emma felt a surge of disgust at the man's transparent hypocrisy. If you're finding this story of a person overcoming obstacles engaging, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. Jake loaded his supplies into a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 strong horses. His movements efficient and practiced. Emma watched him work, noting the quiet competence in everything he did, the way he secured each item with care and attention to detail. There was something reassuring about his methodical approach, something that spoke of reliability and trustworthiness. "Ready?" Jake asked, turning to Emma with the same respectful tone he had maintained throughout their entire interaction. Emma nodded, then hesitated as she looked at the wagon's high seat. Her weakened condition made the climb seem daunting, and she was acutely aware of the townspeople still watching from nearby porches and doorways. The last thing she wanted was to provide them with another moment of entertainment at her expense. Jake seemed to understand her hesitation without explanation. He stepped forward, offering his arm for support, his manner so natural and unassuming that Emma felt no embarrassment in accepting his help. His strength was evident but controlled, and he lifted her onto the wagon seat with a gentleness that spoke of deep respect for her dignity. As Emma settled onto the wooden bench, she felt the eyes of the townspeople upon her one final time. But now, instead of the crushing weight of their judgment, she felt something entirely different. She was no longer the desperate woman begging for scraps on their doorstep. She was someone with a destination, someone with purpose, someone who had been chosen for her worth rather than dismissed for her circumstances. Jake climbed up beside her and took the reins, his presence solid and reassuring. The horses responded to his gentle commands, and the wagon began to move through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge. Emma kept her back straight and her eyes forward, refusing to give the townspeople the satisfaction of seeing her look back with longing or regret. As they passed the general store, she caught sight of Mr. Henderson watching from his window, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Patterson and her companions had gathered on the steps of the bank, their heads together in animated conversation. Emma knew she would be the subject of speculation and gossip for weeks to come. But for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she found that she didn't care what these people thought of her. The wagon rolled steadily through the town's outskirts, past the last of the wooden buildings, and into the open country that stretched toward the mountains. The road was rough and dusty, but Emma found the motion of the wagon strangely soothing after months of uncertainty and instability. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she knew where she would be sleeping that night and where her next meal would come from. Jake maintained a comfortable silence as they traveled. Not pushing for conversation, but not creating the oppressive quiet that Emma had learned to associate with men who had ulterior motives. His attention seemed focused on the road ahead and the surrounding landscape, alert for potential dangers or obstacles. Emma found herself studying his profile, noting the weathered quality of his skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. The steady set of his shoulders that suggested both strength and reliability. "The mountains can be harsh," Jake said eventually, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the wagon wheels and horse hooves, especially for someone not accustomed to the isolation. "If you find that the life doesn't suit you, I'll bring you back to town whenever you ask. No questions, no judgment." The offer was made without fanfare, but Emma understood the significance of it. He was giving her an escape route, ensuring that she didn't feel trapped by her decision. It was another small kindness in a day that had already provided more kindness than she had experienced in months. "Thank you," Emma replied, her voice quiet but sincere. "I appreciate that, but I think I'm ready for a different kind of life than what I found in Cedar Ridge." Jake nodded, understanding implicit in the gesture. "Town life can be hard on people who don't fit the mold," he said. "Mountains don't judge. They're harsh, but they're fair. Treat them with respect, and they'll provide what you need to survive." As they climbed higher into the foothills, Emma began to understand what Jake meant about the fairness of the wilderness. The challenges here were straightforward, honest in their difficulty. Cold was cold, hunger was hunger, and hard work produced tangible results. There were no hidden motivations, no social hierarchies based on arbitrary judgments about worth and respectability. The road became steeper and more winding as they ascended, and Emma found herself gripping the wagon seat as they navigated turns that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Cedar Ridge looked small and insignificant from this height. Its buildings like toy structures scattered across the landscape. The people who had seemed so important and powerful just hours ago now appeared as tiny figures moving through their small world, unaware of the vast wilderness that surrounded them. "It's beautiful," Emma said, her voice filled with genuine wonder as she took in the panoramic view. "It is," Jake agreed, and Emma caught a note of pride in his voice. "Been living up here for 8 years now. Never gets old. What brought you to the mountains?" Emma asked, then immediately worried that she was being too forward with her questions. Jake was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "Lost my wife and daughter to influenza back in Missouri. Couldn't stay in the place where everything reminded me of them. Headed west looking for somewhere to start over and found these mountains. They gave me the peace I needed to heal." Emma felt a deep recognition in his words. Understanding the kind of loss that drives a person to abandon everything familiar in search of something that might ease the constant ache of grief. "I'm sorry," she said simply, knowing that no words could adequately address such pain. "Time helps," Jake replied. "And honest work. The mountains demand your full attention. Don't leave much room for dwelling on what can't be changed." They continued climbing as the afternoon wore on, the air growing cooler and thinner with each mile. Emma found herself breathing more deeply, feeling as though she was inhaling something cleaner and purer than the dusty air of the town below. The scent of pine trees grew stronger, mixing with the smell of snow from the higher peaks and the earthy aroma of rich mountain soil. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks when Jake finally pointed ahead to a clearing where a sturdy log cabin sat nestled among towering pines. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, indicating a fire that Jake had banked before leaving for town that morning. The cabin looked solid and well-maintained with a wide front porch and shuttered windows that spoke of careful craftsmanship. "Home," Jake said simply, and Emma heard satisfaction in his voice. As they approached the cabin, Emma could see evidence of Jake's life in the mountains everywhere she looked. A vegetable garden, now dormant for winter, but clearly well tended, occupied a sunny spot near the house. Stacks of split firewood lined one wall of the cabin, enough to last through the harsh mountain winter. A small barn stood nearby, obviously built to house the horses and any other livestock Jake might keep. Jake brought the wagon to a stop near the front porch and climbed down, then moved around to help Emma descend. Once again, his assistance was offered naturally and accepted gratefully without awkwardness or presumption. Emma's feet touched the ground, and she felt a strange sense of arrival, as though she had been traveling toward this moment for much longer than just one afternoon. "I'll show you around," Jake said, beginning to unload his supplies from the wagon. "You can have the back room. It's small but private, and it stays warm from the kitchen fire." Emma followed him onto the porch, noting the solid construction of the cabin and the attention to detail that had gone into its building. The door was made of thick planks fitted together with obvious skill, and the windows were properly glazed and shuttered against the mountain weather. This was not the rough shelter she had expected, but a real home built by someone who intended to stay. Inside, the cabin was even more impressive. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a well-built table occupying the center of the space. Shelves lined the walls filled with books, tools, and the various necessities of mountain life. Everything was clean and organized, suggesting that Jake had maintained the household himself with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. "This is the back room," Jake said, opening a door to reveal a small but comfortable space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the eastern peaks. He paused, and Emma understood that he had originally intended this room for the family that would never come to join him in the mountains. "It's perfect," Emma said, meaning it completely. After months of sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, the small room looked like luxury itself. The bed was made up with clean linens, and a warm quilt lay folded at its foot. The window would provide natural light during the day and a view of the magnificent mountain landscape. Jake showed Emma around the rest of the cabin, explaining the routines and systems he had developed for mountain living. There was a root cellar for storing vegetables and preserved foods, a smokehouse for curing meat, and a workshop where he crafted the furniture and tools needed for daily life. Everything was designed for efficiency and self-sufficiency. The product of years of learning to live independently in a challenging environment. "The work isn't complicated," Jake explained as they returned to the main room. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, helping with the garden when spring comes. I do most of the heavy work myself, but there's plenty to keep you busy, and the pay is $20 a month plus room and board." Emma's eyes widened at the mention of wages. $20 a month was more than she had dared to hope for. Enough to allow her to save money and plan for a future beyond mere survival. "That's very generous," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's fair payment for honest work," Jake replied matter-of-factly. "I don't believe in charity, but I do believe in paying people what they're worth." As evening approached, Jake prepared a simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread, working with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to cooking for himself. Emma watched his movements, noting the care he took with each task. The way he seasoned the stew with herbs grown in his own garden. The pride he took in the bread he had baked that morning before leaving for town. When they sat down to eat, Emma found herself struggling to maintain her composure. The simple act of sharing a meal at a proper table, of eating food that had been prepared with care and offered with respect, brought tears to her eyes. For months she had survived on scraps and charity, eating alone and often standing, always aware of her status as an unwelcome burden on others. "This is wonderful," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked up from his plate, studying her face with quiet understanding. "When did you last have a proper meal?" he asked gently. Emma considered the question, trying to remember. "Before my husband died," she said finally. "It's been over a year since I sat at a table like this, eating food that was meant for me." The admission hung in the air between them, highlighting the depth of hardship that had brought Emma to this point. Jake continued eating without comment, but Emma saw something shift in his expression, a deepening of the respect he had already shown her. She realized that he understood, perhaps better than anyone else could, what it meant to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. After dinner, Emma insisted on washing the dishes. She was grateful to have a task that allowed her to contribute something to the household. Jake sat by the fire reading a book by lamplight, but she was aware of his presence as a comfortable, reassuring constant. The domestic routine felt strange after so many months of uncertainty. But it also felt deeply right, as though she was remembering how to be human again. When Emma finished in the kitchen, she joined Jake by the fire, settling into a chair that he indicated with a gesture. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and the sound of wind in the pine trees outside created a peaceful backdrop to the quiet evening. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Emma felt safe. Truly safe, not just from immediate danger, but from the grinding uncertainty that had become her constant companion. "Jake," Emma said, her voice soft in the fire-lit room. "Why did you help me today? You could have walked away like everyone else did." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as though he was choosing each one with care. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said. "I know what it feels like to have people look at you like you're something less than human because you're hurting. When I saw you standing there today, maintaining your dignity despite everything they were putting you through, I saw strength that most people don't possess. Emma felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "Most days I feel like I'm barely holding on." "That's exactly what strength looks like," Jake replied, turning to meet her eyes. "Real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every time you do fall, even when you don't think you can manage it one more time." As Emma prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone in the space of a single day. This morning, she had been a desperate woman begging for scraps outside a general store, subjected to the cruel judgment of people who saw her as less than human. Tonight she was sitting by a warm fire in a comfortable home, employed by a man who treated her with dignity and respect, and with a future that held promise rather than just the hope of survival. The mountain wind that had seemed so harsh and forbidding when she first heard it now sounded like a lullaby, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and second chances. As she settled into the comfortable bed in her small room, Emma understood that she had found more than just employment in the mountains. She had found a place where she could rebuild not just her circumstances, but her sense of self-worth and human dignity. Outside her window, the peaks stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky, eternal and unchanging, offering the kind of honest challenge that would allow her to prove to herself that she was indeed as strong as Jake believed her to be. The woman who had been mocked and humiliated in Cedar Ridge was already beginning to fade, replaced by someone who understood that true worth comes not from the opinions of others, but from the courage to keep moving forward despite every obstacle. In the morning, Emma would begin the work of building a new life in the mountains, lifted up not just by Jake's strong hands, but by his recognition of her inherent dignity and worth. The pride she had seen in his eyes as he helped her onto the wagon would become the foundation upon which she would reconstruct her sense of self, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come not from those who have never known hardship, but from those who have walked through their own valleys of despair and emerged with their humanity intact. If you like this story about humanity helping another, please like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin for more stories. Well, folks, that's our story for today. A reminder that even in the harshest times, a little kindness can go a long way. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin for more tales from the Old West. Until next time, happy trails.